In this guest lecture for the University of Eindhoven, I talk about scenario planning. I'm going to talk about what is scenario planning. And first off, I want to ask you a question. Who here likes to play video games? That's about 3 of you. You were quite direct. What is your favorite video game? Oh no, I'm not familiar with that. So Dragon Age Yakuza, I will look into that. But maybe because I'm also a little bit older. I'm 37 right now. But I want to take you back to 1998. And I was at middle school. And every day I was looking forward to then when the class ended, because then I would go home. And then I had 1 hour to play a video game on my computer. And it was really 60 minutes, because next to me was my little brother, Joosten, and I could not play like 61 minutes because he was standing there. Now it's my turn, now I can do 1 hour to play my own video games. And also, Jeroen was better in, maybe you're familiar with Wolfenstein 3D or Doom, like shooters, first-person shooters. But actually my strong suit was, if you can see it, were like more strategy games. And I like to play Command and Conquer, Red Alert. I know, I don't see some familiarity in the room, but it's like where you have like an army and you have to deploy your resources and you have to harvest oil and other material, and then you can buy new power plants, and then you can buy some personnel and soldiers, and you had special soldiers and you had technicians. Well, I was really fond of that game, of using, to sort of simulating that I was in the army. But what's quite interesting is that actually war games are being used to train military personnel. There's a Frenchman, and I have to look at his name. Sorry if one of you is French, but Antoine Bourdieu, whatever. He wrote a book about the history of war games. And it started with Stratego, you're probably familiar with Stratego, and then it kind of developed in other games, and the main goal was for military personnel to be prepared and to train for combat. And what's also quite interesting is that during the 18th and 19th century it was quite straightforward. Like you have the good guys and you have the bad guys and you have troops and you have strategy. But then, of course, during the 80s and 70s, 80s, 90s of the previous century, they kind of became aware that there's more to war than only the good guys and the bad guys. So they developed the so-called matrix games, where you also have like press, you also have like diplomacy, economic interests, they all interplay, and then you also have guerrilla warfare games. And the main objective of all these soldiers playing these games is to be aware of all the interests of all the stakeholders involved, their resources, and also their main objectives. So I will get back to this idea of war games later. But next up, I'm curious, are you familiar with the term VUCA, with a V, V-U-A-C? Do you know that? Well, it's a term that's being used a lot in management, and it's about volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And that's a term which is quite popular now among management thinkers and strategy consultants, that because, for example, of technological developments, the whole environment of organizations is becoming more volatile, more complex, more uncertain, and also more ambiguity. I don't know what's the single word for that. And so how can you deal with this environment if you're in an organization, in a business, or maybe also in a nation or an NGO? Well, there are different methods for that, but it's also quite difficult also, and I like this quote, to predict the outcomes of your own actions. So this is Bruno Latour, a famous French philosopher, and he says that unexpected consequences are the most predictable thing on earth. So you have to deal with this environment, but how can you be adaptive as an organization? How can you also break from your rigid patterns? Because it's a common phrase like, well, we do things here like we always have done before. So So how can you break with that? And that's one method is to think about the future. And there are different methods to look into the future, to sort of predict the future maybe. And this is a survey which is quite dated, but it's sort of got the whole range of different methods to be looking into the future. And it starts on the right with brainstorming, exercises, supply chain analysis. And there you have the situation or wargaming, simulation or wargaming, and then some other analysis. And then on the far right, most popular at that time was scenario planning. So I will be talking about scenario planning. And if I think about the history of scenario planning, that really makes me think of this ancient place. Does anyone of you recognize this? It is in Greece, and it's the Oracle of Delphi. So that's the Apollo temple. And what's really cool is that you have the high priestess, Pythia, over there. And during the 9th warm months of the year, you can go there and you can ask the Oracle about her prediction or her advice about the future. But at that time, it was like a sort of divine intervention that high priestess has about, to give you advice on the future. But now we, of course, live in a day and age of new technology. And there are a couple of examples where already computers are being used to predict the future. So in the 1940s, you had in the UK, you had a pneumoniac computer, which was like a computer made with tanks and pipes and colored water, and that kind of resembled the UK economy. So if you would have some extra water over there, then what would be the influence on the national economy, these kinds of things. And also quite influential was the World Free simulation done by the Club of Rome in the 1970s, where they looked at the resource dependency, environmental loss, and also development of the economy. And that also led to a quite influential report about the situation on Earth. And you might say that we as mankind, we didn't learn a lot from their warnings, but still the method is quite influential. But that's all based on data and quantitative methods. But you also, of course, have the qualitative methods. And one example is the Rand Corporation in the US. They used the so-called Delphi method, where they get experts in a room, they have focus groups, and they talk about what could happen to our industry or a certain domain and what would be the influence on the organization. So that's the sort of the idea of scenario planning, the history of scenario planning, or looking into the future. And I give you 3 examples of famous organizations that used scenario planning. Well, if you Google for scenario planning, then the case of Shell comes up first, actually. They made this method quite popular. And one of the reasons was that during the 70s or something, you had a director at Shell called Pierre Wack, and he was an advocate of using scenarios and also using stories. So at the time, it was a lot of data-driven to look at strategy and the future of Shell. But he decided, well, we have to use our imagination, we have to use stories. So at that time, around the beginning of the 1970s, there was a common belief in the oil industry at that time that the price of oil would only go up because of scarcity and these kinds of developments. But they made a scenario, they made a couple of scenarios, and one of these scenarios, actually the price of oil went down. And they shared it with the management, and the management talked about it and envisioned what kind of things they would do if that would happen, if the price would go down. And then in 1973, the price actually went down. And all their competitors were like, what is going on? And Shell was the only company that actually was prepared for this situation. So they also rose from the 8th in the industry to become number 2 at that time. Well, that's an oil industry, and also from the 70s. A recent example is also Cisco. They looked at the development of the uses of internet, and they looked at a couple of factors. For example, would there be a radical breakthrough in internet technology, and also how would the demand of customers develop over time? And they used these different scenarios to look at their own business models, and also should we change some of our policies. But you can not only use it in cases like Shell and Cisco, like in commercial settings, but I like this example. This is a community of Kunu Yala, if I say it correctly, in Panama. And they use scenario planning in that community to talk about how should we deal with our ocean use, our land use, with our education, with our cultural heritage. And also the authors of a study in which this was a case, they said it led to more collaboration and also learning in the community about how should we look at the future at our community and what choices should we make, for example, with our educational system, but also with tourism and also fishing, for example. So these are 3 examples of scenarios that are being used in a commercial setting, but also in in a non-commercial setting. But the most important thing I want to share with you is the main takeaway of the usage of scenario planning is that they are not predictions. It's not like you want to predict the future, but they should inform you, inspire you, and confront you. So based on these scenarios, that makes you think about your own organization. Maybe should we change our products or services, or maybe do some other strategy changes. So that's the main idea of scenario planning.